Welcome to the last Tocqueville CLP of this year. My name is Brent Nelson, and I'm the director of the Tocqueville Center for the Study of Democracy and Society and a member of the Department of Politics and International Affairs. The Tocqueville Center's collaboration with On Discourse began last November with an event we called American Patriotism Discuss. We invited Black theologian and New York Times columnist Issa McCauley to share his experiences with patriotic celebrations. Plus, we added Furman professors Marian Strobel and Akan Malichi to articulate their quite different perspectives. And then we let you, the students, talk through the issue of patriotism on your own. The event worked so well, and so we tried it again in February with a different topic, the American family. We liked the format, and we decided to try it again with tonight's theme, populism in the United States. But before we get to that, please allow me to do some Tocqueville housekeeping. First, this is our 12th CLP of the year, and that's a lot. None of them would have happened without a host of people working very hard behind the scenes. I would like to ask the following people to please stand up and hold your applause until the end. So our senior distinguished scholar, Jim Guth, Dr. Guth, is standing back there in the doorway and waving. Okay, very good. Lucy Southwell, our program assistant, is in the back. Beth Larive, who is our master web designer and interviewer, and she is not here. And our lead intern, Sim Colson, he is gone tonight. But Maddie Moore, our other intern, is here. She's back there. And Ben Henderson is the other one. And then all of the Tocqueville fellows in the room who have worked very hard this year. Could you all please stand? And now we'll give all of them a round of applause. Oh, and there's Dr. Larive, who just walked in. We thanked you, and that applause was for you. Yeah, none of this would happen without all of those folks working very hard. Second, I trust you received one of those brochures when you came in. For those of you not familiar with the Tocqueville Center, you can read about us in this publication or visit our website, where you'll find a video archive of our public events. You can also sign up for our emails, which will allow you to see soon what we have planned for the rest of the year and for next year. Our next big event is not a CLP. It is Dinn's Day on the 29th. We will be pushing hard to get the most donors giving $5 or more to the Tocqueville Center. And let's see, I think I have a slide to this effect. Look at that. There's the magic QR code. Many of you have been coming to our events for at least 2 years. You know the quality of our programming, and you know that all of this takes resources. Many have been generous to us, but we need each of you to help carry forward our mission. Giving early is possible. $5 and a QR code will get you connected to the most important center of intellectual ferment on campus. Signing up for our emails will also give you an early glimpse at next year's program. We have an exciting one. Get ready for some announcements in the near future. So on to our topic today. Populism is not new to human history, nor is it new to America. Today we are in the midst of one of those periodical populist moments, both in the U.S. and in many other parts of the world. We have enjoyed having 3 of the most prominent students of populism on campus the past 2 days, helping us understand the populist phenomenon. Tonight we have them for one final appearance to help us think through our own views of populism. Let me bring each one to the stage and give you a brief biography. So I'll have you come up one at a time. And you can read their full biographies in your brochure. I'm just going to give you a précis. So please hold your applause until the end. So first of all, Pippa Norris is the Paul F. McGuire Lecturer in Comparative Politics at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. She earned her BA at Warwick University and her MA and PhD at the London School of Economics. Professor Norris has a long list of honors and awards and has published numerous books, including, for our purposes, Cultural Backlash, Trump, Brexit, and Authoritarian Populism, Electoral Integrity in America, and In Praise of Skepticism. Her latest book, the highly anticipated The Cultural Roots of Democratic Backsliding, will be out at any moment from Oxford University Press. Eric Kaufmann is professor of politics at the University of Buckingham and director of the Center for Heterodox Social Science. A native Canadian, Professor Kaufmann earned his BA at the University of Western Ontario and his MA and PhD from the London School of Economics. Professor Kaufmann's many books include Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth? Demography and Politics in the 21st Century, White Shift, Immigration, Populism, and the Future of White Majorities, and The Third Awakening. His most recent book is Taboo, How Making Race Sacred Produced a Cultural Revolution. And finally, Jan Müller is Roger William Straus Professor of Social Sciences and Professor of Politics at Princeton University. He studied at the Free University Berlin, University College London, St. Antony's College, Oxford, and Princeton University, and was a fellow at All Souls College, Oxford, and later a fellow in modern European thought at the European Studies Center, St. Antony's College. His publications include Constitutional Patriotism, Contesting Democracy, and What is Populism, which has been translated into more than 20 languages. Professor Müller's most recent publication is Democracy Rules. Please welcome our panelists. So this is how we're going to proceed tonight. First, I will have each panelist give a short answer to a question I gave them about an hour ago. So I don't know how much they've thought about it, but they've given it a little thought. You will see it on the screen shortly up here. I will then post on the screen a question for you, the audience, to discuss in groups of 3 or 4. So this is not the ideal room to do this in, but I think you're able to do these things. So you just either turn around, groups of 3 or 4. If you have to move around a little bit, that's fine. There are Tocqueville fellows kind of scattered around who can pull people together. So you're going to gather in little groups, and you're going to discuss that question for about 5 minutes or so. And then we'll come back together again and have the panelists answer questions, listen to your comments as you report on what your group talked about, and we'll have a little interaction there. That'll be when you can ask questions. And then we'll do it again. And we'll do it as long as we have time or I have questions. So whichever comes first. And then we'll pull it together with a little end of the session Q&A. So this is a time for you to kind of think through these issues for yourself and to hear your peers talk about these things and people in the community. So try to mix and match a little bit. I see a number of gray hairs out there like mine. And so, mix in with some of the students. The first thing you need to do, of course, always is introduce yourselves. So, get your first names just so you know somebody in your group. Okay, so that's how we're going to proceed. So let's start with the question to the panel. Little introduction here. No matter how you define populism, the Trump-led Republican Party is the latest version of populism in America today. Since most academics are critical of American right-wing populism, I want to pose a controversial question. Come on, there we go. Do you see any good for America coming out of the Trump-led populist movement? All right, so we're going to hear from our 3 panelists first. You be thinking about it, and then you're going to be able to discuss it. So, who wants to take this on? You do have to pass the mic around this time. Sorry.
Okay.
So Eric first.
Okay.
Professor Kaufmann.
Yeah. So let's try and be a bit controversial. So obviously, I think many of us would agree that Trump's sledgehammer approach has done a lot of harm to liberal democratic values and norms. I would agree with that. I do, however, think that the Trumpian makeover of the Republican Party has not been all negative. So I think there were issues. One of the issues in populism is if you have an elite that has a set of views or economic interests that diverge from the majority of the population, it's legitimate to try and bring those views into politics. And so populists have a role in bringing in new interests and values into politics. So I think if we look at the American situation, similarly perhaps to Europe, one of the key issues that elites and masses tended to front is immigration. And Trump did bring that issue into American politics, I think, in a significant way. So I would say in that sense, this is an issue people disagree on. It has to be debated. I think it's a legitimate subject for debate. In addition, one could say that some of these cultural issues, which affirmative action has always been, certainly racial preferences has always been something that 65, 70% of Americans have opposed, and yet nobody's really been willing to take that on. Again, I think it's legitimate, and I think that's another thing that is good to see that being taken on. Again, let's have a debate about it, but if most of the population doesn't want it, I think that's something that should be in the political debate. Now, universities, I'm a bit ambivalent because I don't like what he's doing, using the sledgehammer on anti-Semitism, which is really a restriction on academic free speech. And this haphazard fining of universities and cutting of the research budget. However, I do think there has been a big problem in universities for decades around free speech, around viewpoint diversity, and the universities showed no willingness at all to do anything about it. And I do think that some government intervention in the funding side, not in terms of saying what you're allowed to teach and what you're allowed to research, but in terms of saying what we will fund and what we won't fund, is legitimate. It's just that instead of going to 3 or 4 out of 10, it's been cranked to 11 out of 10. So I'm ambivalent here, but I think that it is forcing universities to think a little bit about where they just leaned into their progressive slant. Now they're actually having to think, is that such a good idea? Should we be taking political positions? Should we just be ignoring the fact that 95% of Ivy League professors donate to the Democrats and a few percent to the Republicans? Maybe that's not so healthy. I think those are good inklings and good self-reflections to have, and it wouldn't have happened without this. So, negative, more negative than positive, but some positive.
So new issues have been introduced. Okay. I got a feeling the two of you might disagree a little bit. So let's see what Professor Norris has to say.
So I'm less concerned about policy debates, but I'm much more concerned about democracy. And here I think that the second Trump administration has posed a fundamental challenge to the Constitution, to the way in which the laws have worked on many different topics, and to the ways that the norms are there, the informal norms that we take for granted. So is that any good? Yes, in the sense it might wake up a stronger defense of liberal democracy. And in that sense, we can think back historically to how these developments have changed over different eras. For example, the progressive era was one where there was tremendous debate about a number of different issues in American governance and governance more generally, issues about corruption, issues about the role of the public, issues about the roles of the institutions. Similarly, I think in the 1960s, we saw another wave in which there were challenges to the ways in which America was being governed. Remember the crisis which was there from, for example, race riots, from challenges over issues like Vietnam and the Great Society programs and race relations, and challenges over new values that were coming onto the table. So I think if there has been a good positive development from the second Trump administration, it's been the shock to liberals, who often took the institutions and the rules of the game for granted, and to think through and question what sorts of reforms we would like to put forward to really strengthen American democracy and liberal democracy in particular. So think about issues, for example, about money in politics. and the ways in which, again, that was an issue from the 1970s after Watergate that we thought hard about and tried to bring in new reforms under the Federal Election Commission. But the Federal Election Commission does not work today. And we've known that for many years. It's been gridlocked by partisanship. So we think again about the role, for example, of can a single individual give $200 million to a campaign? Can we give out checks to voters to encourage them to participate, as again Elon Musk has been doing? Or should we think harder and seriously about campaign funding reform and think about what we could do to really restore some of the ethics and integrity, some of the accountability, and some of the ways in which we want money in politics to work, not necessarily to totally limit its use, but to think harder about what sort of standards of transparency and accountability. Similarly, when we think about the role of Congress and the ways in which it runs, or the ways in which the Supreme Court has now become very much weighted on one side in almost a permanent partisan gridlock, not on every issue, but on many, a 5-4. So do we need to think about the rules of appointment, the ways in which the length of terms that judicial appointments have on the Supreme Court, and the ways in which that form of nomination and process should actually be really strengthened? It isn't working. We know that. We're not getting, as a result, trust in the Supreme Court. So if you wanted to think through how liberals could really rethink some of those rules, what would it be? What would you recommend? And lastly, there are other rules, particularly around elections, which are critical. And we know that trust in elections has declined a lot, trust in electoral integrity, because of claims of fraud and abuse and misinformation to a large extent. But nevertheless, there are ways in which American elections could really be strengthened by specific reforms. And again, there are debates. You'll have heard about ranked choice voting, one of the themes which some states have taken up. And there are other themes, for example, how far we should have independent electoral commissions to create boundaries for districts so that they became more competitive and not held by either one side or the other. So again, I think there are rooms for a liberal alternative and how we can actually improve how elections work in America in many effective ways. And they can be obviously started in democratic states. But for that to happen, we need to have good, solid ideas about what we want for elections. How should they function? What should be the role of money in politics? What should be the ways in which people get registered? What should be the ways in which we have effective campaign debates? So Trump has given a shock to the system, and to use the cliche, every crisis is an opportunity. We know that. When a country feels that the elections are not really working, when they feel that the Supreme Court is not balanced, when they feel that there can be problems about executive aggrandizement, in other words, the power of the president versus the power of the legislature, or other civic society checks and balances, we need to have our own vision, if you believe that the liberals could follow, and good ideas of reforms that you'd like to implement. And maybe they can be blue sky thinking. Maybe they can be things which everybody's going to say, that won't work. But really subjecting those to a criticism and debate in the next 3 years, I think would be the most effective way for liberals to respond. So it's less for me, Eric, about the specific issues. Immigration should be discussed, and Democrats need to get their house in order. Issues of free speech and cancel culture need to be discussed. But above all, if we can't get the rules of the game right, then 2028 is a major challenge for the future of democracy in America, a serious challenge, and we need to meet that. Can it be done? Yes. Other societies can provide for that. They do debate constitutional reform. Think about, for example, debates about the role of the Supreme Court in Israel. Think about the debates about how far we can improve and strengthen some of the other aspects of democracy in many new democracies which have been emerging. And you can see some of those have worked. Think about the debate in the Philippines, for example, about the ways in which the president should be impeached. And that has been very effective in that country. Think about the debates in Poland about the role of the judiciary and how they can be made less partisan and more independent. So we can learn in America from other countries. We can learn from history. And I would really say, would you like to think through the ideas about what you'd like to see as there are major reforms that a Democrat, if they got elected, would actually stand for? And I'll finish with this. I think both Joe Biden always talked about the dangers of Trump and Trump administration to American democracy. And to some extent, we found that the Harris campaign did as well, after some hesitancy. They again took up those cudgels, but all they provided was a criticism. They didn't provide new ideas. And that's not enough. You have to have a positive vision. So what's your vision of how you'd like democracy to work better? What would be the practical ways to do that? And what can we discuss and debate and deliberate about to present a positive agenda for a democratic candidate in 2026, no matter who that candidate is?
All right, so reform the pillars of democracy, bring in new issues. Professor Müller.
So we are supposed to model civil disagreement. I'll try my best. With 3 points. The first one is very pedantic. I think we have to put our cards on the table when it comes to the question, what do we mean when we talk about populism, the thing that everybody's talking about? Here's my suggestion. I'm aware that some of you have heard this yesterday, and again already today, and maybe already twice today. But forgive me for saying once again that at least for me, populism is not about, what is in a somewhat cliched way sometimes referred to as, caring about the common woman, the common man. It's not about mobilizing people. All of these are things which actually any properly functioning democracy should be doing in various ways. For me, populism is about leaders and parties saying that they and only they represent what they often refer to as the real people. It follows from that whoever opposes them can be declared an enemy of the people. Hence, it's inherently, from my point of view, dangerous for democracy. It has a lot of authoritarian potential, and we've seen that potential play out in many, many countries around the world. Turkey, India, Hungary, Poland, you will all know the list. In a rough form. So it's hard for me to say, yes, there's something good about it. Having said that, it is of course true at the same time that we should not conflate, let's say, populism and being a demagogue. In other words, we should not jump to the conclusion that whatever populists have ever said necessarily must be a lie, must be fake, must be about seducing people with wrong promises. Not everything that aspiring populist leaders have brought up as issues has necessarily been unjustified. If you think about, let's say, Turkey, Erdogan had a point when he initially said, look, there are people who are basically left behind, as the somewhat cliched expression goes, by a secular Kemalist elite. God forbid, even Hugo Chavez wasn't entirely wrong when he said Venezuela maybe isn't a perfectly well-functioning egalitarian democracy. So we should not automatically discount everything they say. Having said that, I have a really, really, really hard time thinking of any issue that we wouldn't be talking about or weren't allowed to talk about without the second victory of Donald Trump. It's not true that nobody was allowed to talk about immigration. Who first put barriers between us and Mexico? If I recall correctly, it was Bill Clinton. It's not true that nobody was allowed to talk about the situation at universities, which brings me to my third and maybe most important point. I think we just have to be, here's my disagreement with you, as you can tell, we have to be very careful with these generalizations. Universities, the universities. All 4,000 colleges and universities in the United States? Or are we talking about a super small number of, to be frank, elite institutions with which our national media are totally obsessed, places like the one where Pippa is teaching, where you have a bunch of anecdotes which then, get blown up into, oh, there's anti-Semitism, oh, there's cancel culture, there's this and that. If I recall correctly, the biggest majors in this country remain business and health sciences. And as far as I know, these are not taught by crazy Trotskyists, post-structuralists, etc., who corrupt the youth. Are there problems? Can we have a debate about, universities having done things the wrong way, maybe with DEI? Absolutely. But that was already happening. And I'm very skeptical, if you forgive me, of some of these statistics that say, oh, because 98% of professors donate to Democrats, therefore automatically we should assume, A, that these professors actually indoctrinate their students. I've never seen that happening. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. But from what I've seen in 20 years of teaching in this country, I don't see my colleagues indoctrinating anybody. And I think they ask a very wide variety of questions. It's not like certain things are off limits. And maybe, just maybe, the fact that fewer professors are declaring themselves or showing themselves to be Republicans has something to do with the development of the GOP. A GOP that clearly in many ways has simply turned against science, that has sort of had campaigns against all kinds of subjects, and that nowadays, again, forgive me for being blunt, is basically using a kind of blackmail, saying we're going to withhold the money for cancer treatments, ladies and gentlemen, if you don't do something about the Middle Eastern Studies Department. At the same time, without actually telling universities exactly what they should be doing in some cases, without pinpointing any evidence where they would say, you've done this wrong and that wrong, which, again, is not off limits. It's not, we could have a debate about this, but forgive me, it's more than a sledgehammer. Sledgehammer simply seems to imply, we could be doing this in a nice way, they're doing it in a sort of nasty way, but it's simply illegal what is happening. And other populists in other countries have also done it. They've, in a sense, tried to subdue universities in various ways, and it's bad news for everybody, even if you're a conservative. It's bad news. You don't want the government to be in the business of bullying and blackmail and saying, we're going to start telling you, how you have to structure your department and what you can teach, etc., etc. So again, the point is not that universities have done everything right. The point is not that, you couldn't criticize certain elements of what has been happening in the last couple of years. Absolutely right. But the way it's being done and the background picture, which people sometimes are repeating in terms of, there have been these horrible things without any evidence, that I think is something dangerous. I'm not sure that was civil enough, but at least I tried,
I promised that we would have a diversity of opinion, and so we do. And so now you get a chance to work through these ideas on your own. Now remember, this is an on-discourse thing. We treat each other the way we would want to be treated. So we listen to one another, we engage ideas, and we treat each other with the dignity that everybody deserves. So with that in mind, find your foursome. And there's your question. It's exactly the same one. Ready, set, go. At this point, you can ask any question you want. If there was something in your group, you're like, I don't know, I didn't really get that one argument. Or if there are some comments about, did you come up with a plan? Did you feel like you talked about some of these issues that haven't been talked about before, or something like that? So the floor is yours for a few minutes, and who has a question, who has a comment? Yeah, okay, Poland.
So the idea of the Trump, very much leaning into the populist movement this go around more so than the first, I think we would all agree. And what do you all think, because it's very unique in that all three of you all are actually not Americans by birth, and so you all have a much different perspective from us. What do you see as the resiliency of the U.S. right now to not let this be an ongoing thing, but to let this be a chapter and to say, okay, we both sides have something to learn from this? And do you all think we have the resiliency as a democracy, or do there need to be fundamental changes? Because some people would say it's worked for a few hundred years at this point, but we're also seeing things that are very different from both sides of the aisle that we've never seen before. And so what would you all say is, where would you all say is the resiliency at this point in the U.S. to kind of move past this? And
That's a really good question. Should we go one more step? Because I think we might have a disagreement, because my view is that the U.S. system is resilient, is that this, for example, the Supreme Court will act as a check, and you've got Congress there, and I'm not as, I also think too, this just in terms of whether things really go off the rails, I think there are enough cross-cutting cleavages. So, for example, not every white person is a Republican and not every minority is a Democrat. In fact, there's a lot of cross-cutting on there, and I think for those two reasons, I think it's pretty resilient, and that would be my view. But I know that's not Pippa's.
So my view is that if we look worldwide, most of the countries which have had democratic backsliding are not liberal democracies. In other words, they're the countries which actually benefited from the third wave of democratization, right? Central and Eastern Europe, Latin America, a number of African and Middle East countries and so on, and Asia. But most liberal democracies have actually persisted quite well, despite populist parties, and they've been both incorporating them into government, incorporating them into parliaments, and also thinking about some of their issues in different ways. And we can think about countries which have had, take the Brexit situation, challenges of populism in the United Kingdom, but now they're back to a strong Labour government. Well, it's got a large number of majorities in the parliament, even if it's not terribly effective. So you can have back and forth in any democracies. The problem, of course, is those countries which have had fewer institutions that have persisted. Particularly, they've had elections, but they haven't had, for example, effective judiciaries, which have been independent, or a long tradition of cultural norms. So some of those norms have come back when have been challenged and so on. So that's the resilient side. Against that, you can also argue that the problem is that America, it's a long-term vision, but that America's kind of been asleep at the wheel. It's been complacent, partly because of the length of time. And so we assume that, of course, things are going to go on. Why? Because nobody in America has experienced authoritarianism in the way that you have in Eastern Europe, or that you have in Asian countries, or that you have in Latin America in the 1980s. So it's a two-edged sword, right? And it can go either way.
I assume it's obligatory to mention Tocqueville at some point on these occasions. So here's a somewhat Tocquevillian point. I think it's not entirely an accident that at least some countries which recently have moved in a populist/authoritarian direction also happen to be very centralized. And so aspiring autocrats could capture 2 or 3 institutions, and it was basically game over for democracy. The United States is obviously a very big country, very complex and fairly decentralized. It's an interesting twist, since you asked about, different sides learning different things. Of course, for many liberals, the left, federalism for a long time was a very problematic thing because it simply ended up shielding racist practices from the federal government. All of a sudden, the situation flips and people say, wait a minute, maybe that can also provide a focus for resistance, and maybe also other countries which have federalism in their constitution. Some countries even have it in such a way that you cannot change it under any circumstances. Maybe had something right about the fact that this is an important check quite beyond sort of the official nationwide branches in terms of saying it's just going to be more difficult to really kind of subjugate a whole country if you have basically a dispersal of power. Having said that, I would basically agree with everything that Pippa suggested in terms of important reforms. It's always a question of how the hell do you get there. I think some of us, at the risk of saying something sacrilegious, might also point to the Constitution and say that, look, it has sort of built-in structural problems, what some of our colleagues would talk about as a possibility of a tyranny of the minority, if you look at the Senate and what it can do on the basis of what kind of level of popular support. But that's, in a sense, even harder to think about any real change. But at least it should be in the conversation as something that one should be reminded about.
I want to just quickly address Boland's comment. We purposely chose people who were not obviously from America. I mean, Eric sounds American, but he's Canadian. That will change soon when they become the 51st, and then he'll have his own American passport. But it takes the emotion out a little bit to have somebody from the outside look in. And so if you had, 2 Democrats and 1 Republican up here, it might feel different. But this, I think, helps us abstract a little bit and think about these issues less personally. Okay, anybody else have something? Like, was there any group out there saying, I can't believe Professor Norris wants to change the electoral system? That's crazy. Nobody did that? Everybody wants to change the electoral system? Oh, bam, slam dunk. Yeah, go ahead.
To your point, I do, and I actually asked this at another grouping like this. The United States Constitution is designed to force compromise, and it sort of presumes good faith on all parties. And part of what we're seeing now is what happens when you have 2 major parties that refuse to work with each other. It can't function properly without good faith on all sides and presumption that people are acting in good faith. So if you're talking about making a change, how would you change that?
So that's an important question. How do you change that? And one thing is that essentially there are many ways in which, when we're talking about the Constitution, what we're trying to do is change the incentives for the political behavior. change the incentives facing politicians in how they can get together and things like that. And the simplest example is something like ranked choice voting in multi-member districts, because the idea is if you only have to appeal to your MAGA base or you only have to appeal to your Democratic base in Cambridge, then of course, why would you bother to actually try to reach out to the centre, to the independent voters who might swing your way? You're going to preach to the converted, basically, because that's what's going to get you elected time and again and get you seniority and get you a career and therefore give you the power that you want or the office that you want. Now, if you have an incentive also to change those ways in which you can get your primary votes to work, you still have primaries, but you basically, for example, have an open primary, as has been tried, where it doesn't matter whether you are a Republican or a Democrat, people vote in a primary, but you can vote for either candidate, and the top two candidates are the ones who have the runoff. And that means that basically there's a different set of incentives for being a candidate. What are you going to promise? What are you going to serve? How do you work? And that should lead, therefore, to more moderate candidates and therefore to parties working together. And if I were to show you the map of party polarization from some of the legislative votes in the 50s, there were many independent, middle-of-the-road candidates and middle-of-the-road members of the Senate and the House. Remember, the Senate was collegiate. You worked together. That was the tradition. Even with the Ted Kennedy, who was very liberal, he would work with the conservative side to get stuff done. But the ways in which the primaries have expanded, the ways in which the parties have become polarized, and the ways in which the election therefore produces incentives now has the opposite. You appeal to your base, you don't bother about the rest of the country. And remember that a third of the country is at least independent, meaning that they're not consistently one, they're not consistently the other. They're often less engaged in politics, they're more moderate, but you have to encourage politicians to reach out beyond their base. That's the key thing. And the rules of the game are the way to do it, for my money.
Well, so I just want to sort of try a different tack or try. I agree to a large extent, but I also think we have to bear in mind that, in fact, there is pressure to come to the center. I mean, Trump obviously on abortion, on Social Security, you'll tack to your base during the primaries, but you've also got to tack to the middle in the election. So I think there are pressures to go to the middle, and clearly, if you're seen as too radical, you can pay a price at the midterms or in the alliances. So I think that's one point, is it's not all, the incentive isn't like Northern Ireland politics or some of these places where really it's outbidding towards the flanks and that's it. The other thing I would say is too, in a parliamentary systems also, if Trump existed in a parliamentary system, his power would be, is the mic not on or no?
No, it's on.
His power would be much greater, I think, actually, if you had, you have no court checking you because there's parliamentary sovereignty. Everyone is whipped into a vote, and so I actually think the U.S. system has more pressure points, actually. Anyway.
Liz Truss.
What happened to it? Oh, I see.
Just one additional point. Modern democracies don't work without well-functioning political parties. It's not an accident that if you look around the world today, every basically far-right populist authoritarian leader leads their own political party in an extremely authoritarian way. Now, lots of people are not very fond of this idea of internal party democracy, usually sitting around all night debating finer points of political philosophy. Who wins the debate? Usually the middle-aged man who doesn't have to get up early in the morning, who talks the best, etc., etc. All these criticisms are fine, but it allows a certain pluralism within parties. It allows legitimate opposition, because after all, you are co-partisans. It's not like you're the enemy. You kind of agree on principles, but you have other disagreements. So if you have that, it's less likely that a leader can simply basically treat a party as unquestioning support. It's less likely that parties become personality cults. And whenever one sees a party sort of going in this direction, or in some cases, in the Netherlands, the far-right populist party only has one member. That person mostly agrees with himself. That's sort of a bad sign. And some countries basically have very robust party laws and say, look, you have to have a certain degree of internal democracy, because if you don't, we take this as a kind of indication that if you come to power, you might generally have a relatively authoritarian approach.
Okay, let's go on to the second panel question. In what ways is populism permanently changing America? Who wants to start that one? Not Eric. Somebody other than Eric, probably.
So there are so many ways that there could be potentially a permanent shift. It's always premature to know, but we know that in the second term, that's the biggest impact for populists. And the third term and the fourth term, in many cases. It's not the first term, because the first term, the adults in the room are going to constrain the president, and we know that presidents don't necessarily know how to get things done, but by the second term, with Project 2025, they do. But I think the most important impact is the one which is going on right now in terms of liberal internationalism. And what I mean by that is there are certain principles which America has been guided by in terms of its foreign policy for 80 years. It started with Woodrow Wilson. It started with the development of a sense that America has to work with its partners. And institutions of 1945 set the stage, and it was American leadership which did that. What is liberal internationalism? 3 principles. Free markets has always been part of the American foreign policy, promoting competition, promoting lowering barriers, making sure that there can be a movement of people in the past, immigrants for work, but also goods, services, and investment. And that's being challenged. And all you have to do is pick up your New York Times, the tariffs go on, the tariffs go off. The problem is that that erratic challenging to the notion of free market competition has some permanent consequences for your trade partnerships and for who's going to trade with whom, because other countries are going to respond. The second principle of liberal internationalism is to work through multilateral institutions, meaning that America has always had a hegemony, it's always been dominant within institutions, but the rules of the game have been set to try to promote core American values in the past. And these are values of things which are very dear to American hearts, but have been adopted as the rules. So the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, a UNDP for development, working with other partners to try to get rules-based institutions at the regional and the international level. And that's being challenged. And as many people see, what we're moving from is a position of American predominance as the world superpower, bounded by rules, but accepting that, to a world of multipolarity, meaning that there are going to be different forces on different issues, and in some ways American power is going to shrink dramatically. And we're going to see not just the rise of China in Asia and its neighbors, not just the military power of Russia, but other powers which are going to be much more competitive, and whoever is the strongest superpower in that region is going to predominate. And America is going to retreat from that attempt to really to work within the rules. And then the third thing is that there's going to be a change in terms of the values which in American foreign policies followed. And the policies have been those favoring democracy, rule of law, order, stability, and basically mechanisms of conciliation where there is conflict. And again, those are the values which Joe Biden said was the heart of what America was, as he saw it, and he tried to revive those through NATO, protecting the coalition on Ukraine, through promoting democracy around the world by having summits on that, promoting international institutions that could strengthen those values. And again, all of that's gone. It's not just the shuttering of USAID, which was the main agency promoting democracy. It's the disrespect for human rights and even the concepts of human rights and challenging those. It's breaking treaties on things like climate change in Paris. It's changing the ways in which America is working with the world. So instead of having these stable institutional guidelines, we now have basically negotiations on a one-on-one basis, not even with America, not even with the State Department, but personally with the president. And that is not a system which is going to be stable. It's going to open America up to corruption and to other challenges. And the world order, I hate to sound so apocalyptic, but the world order as we know it is changing. Soft power is out, hard power is in. And I think it's the biggest challenge that America is facing. And how we create any new order out of that, even if Trump disappears, how are we going to create a stable world order after that? I'm not sure about. There'll be thin institutions still left. You'll still have the UN. You'll still have the General Assembly. You'll still have the European Union. and various regional organizations. But the basic principles that we've known for 80 years have gone in terms of the respect that America has for those. And in some ways, America has done this itself. I mean, that's the tragedy of what's going on. It's not that a foreign power has come and broken down those institutions. There have been challenges in the past, but America has voluntarily given up its role as the world's superpower within these rules. I'm not an international relations expert, but I've been writing about that recently, and that seems to mean the most permanent shift.
Yeah, so I agree with a lot of that, actually, around the rules-based order being threatened. But I guess the question is around permanency. And I don't think any of this is permanent, needs to be permanent. I mean, the U.S. has had, they have had anti-immigration populism in the 1850s, in the 1890s, and the 1920s. They've had, Roosevelt, you had the populist movement at the turn of the 20th century. You have had, populism in the upcountry, South Carolina against low country. So we've had lots of populisms, Jacksonian populism. They got absorbed, the energies got absorbed. Some of the reforms stayed on. The Democratic Party is an heir of that. So I think in the long term, I think these things are not going to fundamentally, need not fundamentally upend the apple cart. Now, what I would say is there's no question there's a threat to the liberal international order. And I think, again, this is a question of sledgehammer versus scalpel. I do think that definitely there was a case for reform of a lot of, or at least looking critically at some of the international organizations, the way in which funded NGOs permeate the United Nations, permeate the European Union, which represent a very narrow spectrum of views of the public. And I think there is an issue there. I really wish you would have had a Republican Party that would say, look, we need to reform these institutions positively. We need to reform maybe USAID. They're spending money on things that are nakedly political, and that's got to go. That's a scalpel. But burn it all down is terrible. And getting rid of soft power, terrible. So I think, again, this is my frustration, is there's an opportunity to try and say, we need to democratize these institutions, bring them more in line with where voters are, but instead they've kind of gone to the slash and burn and burned up a lot of American soft power. So yeah, I'm not a fan of that.
So if something has happened once, it means it can happen again. And that's the reason why it's so incredibly difficult to restore trust. I think I would echo Pippa's points that other democracies are never going to trust the United States again. They're going to think this could all happen again. So I think it's very, very difficult to imagine that, so to speak, Humpty Dumpty can be put together again. Also domestically, I think so much damage has been done. If you look at other countries which voted authoritarian populists out, they have found, think of Poland at the moment, for instance, that it's incredibly difficult to restore the integrity of institutions. There are real dilemmas also that sometimes you might have to end up breaking the rules in order to restore, larger values, but on the other side can say, look, now they're doing it. So it's an incredible challenge, and it's very hard to see how it can be done without, leaving some permanent scars, let's say. One last point, so this is not really about populism, if you forgive me, but it may be an interesting thing to think about as you talk amongst yourselves next. One question one might have is, so has our style of politics permanently changed? Have our ways of mobilizing people permanently changed? And I don't want to sort of open a whole, can of worms about what is the true meaning of social media. Is it good or bad? Is it inherently populist or not? But I think many of our colleagues would say, yes, it actually does present a new way of mobilizing people. In the old days, we only basically had clientelism. I'll give you something if you vote for me. We had parties with large bureaucracies that got people to vote. And now leaders can address citizens directly. Think of someone like Bolsonaro in Brazil, who initially really was just in his backyard with his cell phone. Eventually, he also got big business behind him and so on. But initially, that's all he had. Now, that's not inherently populist, I think. That's not inherently bad. But one might imagine that we're now in an age where if you can't do this at all, if, let's say, you're a leader of the party who holds hands and says, we will win, people are just going to laugh and say, that's not a way to mobilize people. That's not a good style. So maybe we're thinking about whether, in a sense, our political culture more broadly has changed in certain ways that actually will not change back to a more traditional way of doing politics.
All right, ready for you all to get in your groups again. What's changed permanently? How's your life going to be different when you graduate? Go. Like, did you come up with something different than you heard up here? Something that you didn't really hear about, but you think is really changing in America? I heard something over here about, healthcare. Like, is that really changing permanently? But maybe somebody else has something. Yeah, Jack. Jack.
I guess I just wanted to ask, is the way that the government, I guess, is operating, is that changing, whether permanently or not, of like the way that like Trump's treating the bureaucracies of the government, and I guess turning it a little bit away from a meritocracy into targeting, I guess, specific organizations. I guess how is populism affecting that?
Okay. Yeah. Well, populism is motivating the attack on the bureaucratic agencies, and I think, again, I would go with a scalpel versus sledgehammer approach. He's applied a sledgehammer. I think that cutting people willy-nilly, saying they got to come up to the office every day, what that's going to probably do is make the government a less attractive place to work and lower the quality of people who are going to be willing to work in the government. So yeah, I think it's going to have a negative effect. I mean, you could, again, if only they'd gone in and said we need to have some reforms here, perhaps we maybe need some more political appointees so that the agencies don't frustrate the aims of the government. That would be fine, but it's gone way past that to just these random cuts and chaos and delegitimating government, which I think is a bad idea.
And so I'm going to bring in some other ideas. We know that you're losing a tremendous amount of expertise in the federal bureaucracy, and that's a problem. People who've worked for 20 or 30 years, scientists, climate change, NOAA, people who predict the weather, right? But at the same time, simply having the federal government work as it does, I mean, we know that it doesn't work in lots of regards. And so we might want to think about some of the ideas of abundance, which you'll have heard about, I expect, as Ezra Klein's latest way to try to change the agenda. So what he says is that the problem is that the Conservatives want small government, so they try to cut it, and that's one approach. The Democrats, however, have a problem, because the Democrats also don't trust government, and what they try to do is regulate. And by regulating so much, it means that America cannot build all the things that we want to do. Do we want to have high-speed trains like they have them in Japan? Do we want to have housing which is affordable so teachers and nurses can afford to buy houses? Do we want to have a variety of good public services like public transport, good schools and so on? And what Ezra Klein argues is that we need to think through much more creatively what the goals of our government is going to be and how we can actually deliver effectively, sometimes by deregulating where there's so much red tape and so many problems in how you actually build things that we can't get anything done. The classic example is California, which is, I forget how much is being spent on that high-speed rail network. It was something in the billions, 30 billion or something like that. It's been going on forever and is not connecting all the key things. And I mean, think about the gridlock that you get in California, anybody who's driven around LA. You know that simply relying on roads doesn't work. You know that high-speed rail is not a pie in the sky. If you go to places like Japan, you can get between Tokyo and Kyoto and so on in a couple of hours, and everything is beautiful. You go to France, you go to Germany, and you have a great rail system, I think. No, not in Germany, okay. Well, in France and so on. So it can be done, but we're not doing it. And yeah, well, that's also like Britain, which had British Rail, which was great, and now it's totally fallen into a hole. But you can do these things, but we're not doing them. So Democrats need to say we have faith in government, but we need to reinvent, to use the Al Gore cliche, some of the ways we do things, and to be able to build what we want. And we start the book with 2050. What do we want to see in America, and why are we not getting there? And I think that's a challenge for the Democrats to think about the politics of abundance.
So I think it's a complicated question in terms of what is happening right now on the basis of which agenda, because I think it's different groups doing similar things but for different reasons. So you might say that part of what is happening is an old-style libertarian agenda, which was always about, shrinking the government, and then, as the famous phrase went, strangling it into the bathtub. Always seemed a very strange metaphor, but never mind. So that's obviously something that people can appeal to. But there's also, as everybody knows, the kind of Silicon Valley utopianism, where you basically say, look, it's not just about shrinking the state, it's somehow reorganizing everything somehow. And it's a little bit of a question of, I think, which sort of agenda might or might not get discredited as a result of on-the-ground effects of what has been happening. I mean, nobody can wish for catastrophes as a result, but in all likelihood, bad things will happen. And then it's a question of what kind of conclusions one draws from that, including, last point to get us back to populism, so it's not that unusual that what was famously or infamously in Project 2025, among other things, which is to say, okay, we basically have to push back the deep state, and we have to really control the bureaucracy. Basically, all populist leaders have run this argument. They've all said, look, there's a kind of hostile administration, and if you find anything attractive in sort of my basic conception, they have a certain logic to what they say, because ultimately they can say, look, who is the state for? It's there for the people. We and only we represent the people, so it's totally okay if basically partisan actors replace, these other guys who are basically working against the people. So we've seen that. That's in a sense the easiest to discredit or argue against in certain ways. But I think it's going to be very contingent in terms of what kind of conclusions might people draw in 5 or 10 years from this whole story and how it played out and who was really moving for what reason.
What are the possibilities that the Democrats will develop populist movement, not just a reform movement, but a populist movement? What might it look like? I think Jan probably ought to. He's gone first. He has to go. He always gets to go last. He's already thought about it all.
Well, so 2 cop-outs. One is simply that I don't do predictions, especially not about the future. Secondly, as you can tell by now, from my point of view, there's nothing remotely desirable about developing a populist movement. If it's a question about popular mobilization, I think it will depend on strategic choices in terms of saying, okay, again, it's a little bit about can we put Humpty Dumpty back together again? And some might conclude, look, we've already seen this once. We had Trump 1.0, and then it looked like there was some restoration of normality, and it seemed like, no, that was somehow not good enough. So one could imagine, I mean, I'm not a consultant party strategist or anything, but one could imagine somewhat bolder approaches by somebody said, look, what's really happening now? What is happening now is the destruction of a certain New Deal settlement. And if you want to at all save that and extend that, you have to put something much more radical together. You cannot go back to some kind of, centrist wonderland, because you do need to mobilize people much more comprehensively. And I think that's a general point that sometimes has been made, I think rightly, that anything that looks too much like, oh, we're just here to restore things, or anything that also sounds too technocratic, has real shortcomings in the face of populist onslaughts. So a bolder person might say we really need to have a real push for something that goes way beyond a sort of basically restorationist agenda, anything that sounds too much like back to normality, trust us, and so on. Now, whether that personnel is there to kind of have that bolder agenda and develop it, who knows? Alluding to something that Pippa said earlier on, it could be that the shock of what is happening is so profound that you do see much more civil society mobilization. It might sound overly cynical, but some people who support the Democrats, of course, are often very ready to say that actually they don't really want that. They don't want permanent civil society mobilization. They want people to do something around election time, but Democratic donors want this sort of, don't want this kind of constant mobilization. Remember what happened with Obama after 2008. Thank you very much for electing me, and now tone it down and retreat and so on. So a lot will depend on whether anybody can sort of pull this off or not. Which I know didn't really answer the question, but I hope was halfway interesting anyway.
Well, yeah, so I think the Sanders model is really what left populism would look like, and I do think it could have some legs. There is high inequality, for example, and I think it would have some pickup. I haven't sort of seen the surveys and the data on this, but obviously Sanders could have been the nominee at one point. So yeah, I think that certainly is a possibility. Populism based on attacks on the economic, financial elites, whether those be tech-based or Wall Street-based, as against Main Street. I could see that kind of a line working. I do want to introduce something else, which is this question of culture. David Goodhart has, in his book, The Road to Somewhere, makes this argument that it is easier for the right to move left on economics than the left to move right on culture. And although there are some examples, I mean, in Denmark, the Social Democrats have moved, quote unquote, right on culture and have become quite restrictionist on immigration and are doing very well. There's a kind of left-wing, kind of populist party. I don't think that's likely here in the United States, however. I think the commitments from donors, from party activists, are just too strong on the left to go there. But I think the economic populism could be a useful strategy. So I don't count that out as a possibility.
Thanks, Eric. So let's think about populism in terms of its definition, and what would a democratic form look like, and what would it mean? It could look like Bernie Sanders, but frankly, Bernie has been around a long time. You can all sing the same song whenever he comes onto the stage. He's very popular, as you've seen from the rallies, but he's not the future of the party. AOC has tried to kind of step into his shoes, which is an interesting phenomenon. But there are many other leaders within the Democratic Party who I think provide this outsider sense, which is very common in populists, where you feel that you're not part of DC, you're not part of the establishment, you're not part of the old guard, you have a fresh perspective. And I think particularly about, for example, when Obama first came onto the stage, I was very lucky because I was in Boston, and by accident I went to the convention on the day which he was going to give his keynote speech. I'd never heard of him before, nobody had, but he came onto the stage and he electrified everybody. And this was like the Tuesday. It wasn't a high day for the Democratic Convention. The main speakers were going to come on later for the next few days. But his presence, his vision of hope, which is always an attractive thing for many Americans who think about Reagan and his vision of optimism, and that'll be a tremendous contrast to the negative vision by the Republicans. So I think there could be, I wouldn't call him a leader who's going to take us out of this, but certainly some fresh blood in the party. And that could be very attractive if somebody can position themselves as an outsider. And it could be one of the governors who has a profile, but is not that well known, a Gretchen Whitmer, for example. It could be a Pete Buttigieg, even though he's so articulate, but he has some issues which could be problematic electorally as a president, but as a vice president, it'd be an incredibly good, strong ticket. And so one could think about different leaders within the Democratic Party who could provide that outsider status, which is important. But what else is it about populism that would give them that edge? And one of the first things about populism is it's anti-establishment, meaning it's anti-corruption. Think about all those claims about fraud and the ways in which you can't trust government, you can't trust Congress, you can't trust the main institutions. So somebody who can have a crusade against corruption in America at the end of the Trump administration, if it is in the end in 2026, could be very popular, could be very attractive to many people who are sick and tired of the role of money as another theme, but also the corruption that you get just from patronage politics, from favoring some groups, some corporations, some individuals, and expecting that that's the way to negotiate benefits. If we could appeal to, as it were, the angels on our politics, and a better way of doing politics through effective reforms to really bring back that sense that you can trust, and you can have some sense that government is going to work for you, not just for people lining their own pockets. So fresh leadership is the first strategy. An anti-corruption agenda would be a second. And then really taking this opportunity, not just, the third thing is, not just to respond to the shiny ball which is thrown out by the Trump administration every day, but to think longer term, to think in 2028, again, what do we want the Democratic Party to stand for? And can that be something which can actually be breaking out of the old rigidity? And something like abundance, again, is only one idea, but it's certainly a way that the Democratic Party between now and the election could think forward about what its core values are and how can those principles be made more effective and become more popular to the American public. At present, the Democrats are at their lowest level, according to many polls, that they've ever been in the recent years, and they need to reinvent themselves, not just by replacing the top leadership, that's fine, I do think that's important in Congress, they haven't been very effective, and they're guard. Not just by bringing the Bernie Sanders back. We've had that, and that did not elect anybody in 2006. It didn't elect Bernie Sanders, and the agenda in 2026. I can't even get my dates right now. It's a long day. Anyway, 2016 and then 2024. So they need to think afresh. And is it the best way to go forward? Well, it can be one opportunity. But again, it's just standing back, thinking about those ideas and that positive vision, I think will be the best way for the Democrats to move forward. And you can call it populist or not, but you can always steal some clothes from populism, but still retain some expertise and some other forms of traditional democratic politics, but with new packaging, maybe a new style, and new ways to move the Democratic Party forward. It needs a radical shake-up, in my view, and I expect many of you may or may not agree with that, but a radical way of thinking these issues through is really important to provide a different intellectual agenda, a different policy agenda, and a different democratic agenda with a small d for the future of the party.
Yeah, I'm going to offend all of our fine guests here. And I mean, I don't think any of that is populist. You know, if you apply the same criteria that you use for right-wing populism to left-wing populism, then we've got to find, I don't consider I'm one of those passionate independents right now, so I'm not a Democrat, but to invigorate the Democratic Party with a populist element, it has to be somebody who is way outside. Like I can't think of. Right. Is Bruno Mars American? He is, right? Okay. It's got to be someone like that. Yeah, but yes, I do. But she's way too conservative, even as a Democrat. I mean, you've got to talk about somebody who can mobilize people who will one day take over the Democratic Party so that the Barack Obamas and the Joe Bidens and the Kamala Harrises say, I don't have a party anymore. Just like I said that as a Republican. That is the populist that would be needed to do that. And most Democrats would be really, really uncomfortable with that. But it would have to be that kind of outsider who would generate energy from people who are really on the outside of American mainstream life. It would be found in the social media influencers. It would be found in pop music or indie music or even further out music. It would be on obscure Reddit sites. It would be gamers. It would be those are millions of people. Trump was able to mobilize people who never thought about ever voting. And there are potential Democrats like that too. And they're buried in their bedrooms playing video games now. But I think, now I don't know if that's going to happen. But it would be, as ugly as the Trumpian takeover of the Republican Party. No, way too establishment. You guys would come up with much better. Come on, somebody give me some ideas I just came up with one off the top of my head. I would have said Snoop Dogg, but that tells you what generation I'm from. So, I mean, somebody who is 30. Yeah. Yeah. He's not edgy enough. He's way too acceptable to to.
I think that the people in popular culture and social media, at some point, to get popular, you have to be acceptable to a lot of people.
Yeah, but okay. Well, okay. I'm just trying to think about Donald Trump. His only fan base was The Apprentice. Now, it was the #1 show for like 13 years, but people like me never watched it because we just completely dismissed it. Well, how many Democrats would, watch John Legend? But isn't that part of populism? I know it's not Jan's definition, but I would put a central leader in the middle of the populist movement. Without that, I don't think you. Well, no. Okay, I'm not going to get it. Hey, folks, we are up on time, and you have been very patient, and we have had great panelists, so let's give them a round of applause. And you're dismissed.